Well, in my last video, somebody asked me to. The start of my last video was actually me at the oil rig, and kind of showed me driving off. And someone asked, "Could you please explain, how you got your job?" And uh, this isn't going to be a video that's just a biopic because, as I was thinking about it, really there's a very interesting analogy that again can be related to my personal life about the regulatory state. Um, Put it very simply, I have never heard of or seen any licensing of any kind for my job, for anything that I do. As far as I'm aware, I don't even think that my boss has any kind of license or permit or anything to engage in the business that he's engaging in. That it is basically, as best as I can tell, certainly at my level, all done on a handshake and a contract that is not in legalese but is in plain English that me and my boss write. That is literally one paragraph, two paragraphs long. Um, so how did I get my job? I finished college in 2008. I realized more than a year before I got my degree that my degree was probably not going to be very helpful. As it turned out, it was slightly helpful in getting my first job. It's something that's on my resume, but I don't think it was needed to get where I am today. I had an outstanding offer from a family member, an uncle of mine who lived in Texas, who had been, he was basically retiring, but he'd worked in the oil industry for a very long time. And he essentially retired. He was still doing some contracting work, but his former employers, who included Halliburton, he had actually worked for another company for many, many years that he has a lot of loyalty to that was absorbed by Halliburton, and eventually he was essentially a Halliburton employee, and they were beseeching him if he knew anybody who wanted a job, and he always had been thinking about me. And I said, well, that sounds very tempting, but I'd like to finish school. I've already sunk an awful lot of money and time into it, and I'm relatively close to finishing, so I'd prefer to do that. I think that is, by the way, just as an aside, I think that is a rationale that does a lot of people a lot of harm because a lot of people stick with something way longer than they should. But in my case, I was almost done. Although it took another year, I was at that point. I really only needed like one or two more classes and a few other things. Um, anyway, so I finished college. I moved to Texas, and this was in the summer of 2008. It was during the 2008 Olympics, I recall. And basically, he would drive me around to all of his former employers, friends. It's a very kind of buddy buddy network in a way that I really don't like. I mean, I don't like nepotism and whatever. And basically, in the years since he had first been beset by requests to work, and then the situation had changed. This was as the crisis of 2008 was looming, and signs of it were becoming pretty evident. And there was a major pullback in oil going on at that time, and uh, they basically were saying we have stacks and stacks of applications to do his job. Now his job, he always described himself as quote unquote a mud engineer. Often today they're referred to as mud fluid specialists. Just a long story short, a mud engineer is somebody who conditions the mud that they use to drill. When they drill a well, they pump not always mud, sometimes they pump air, but oftentimes they pump mud to the bottom of the hole, and that's what brings all the material that's drilled up. If you don't do that, you're drilling rock and it's just going to form a big pile of ground up rocks that actually prevents you from drilling. And if you actually want a hole, you got to pump it out. And so drilling fluid does that in addition to many other purposes. And that was his job. And we were just going around. We spent about a month, uh, going to visit his friend here, his friend there. And basically the response we were getting is, yeah, you can apply, but they were, already had lots of applicants, and basically they would in general be much more qualified than I was. People with degrees that are actually relevant, people with experience, uh, and he started to feel really bad because he felt like he had me come down to Texas thinking he could get me a job, and it turned out that he couldn't. But he said, well, there are other jobs in the oil field, and you would probably enjoy some of them. And the one that came to mind was a position that he referred to and is most colloquially known, or in jargon of the oil field, is known as a mudlogger, which is basically essentially somebody who makes a map of the well. As they drill the well, The mud logger looks at the rocks that comes to the surface, along with any other data that comes up, like how much gas, how much oil, that sort of thing, and essentially builds a map or a log of the well. And this has multiple purposes. It helps the oil company, in the immediate drilling. They know what kind of rocks that they're in, which can help them determine what kind of bits to use, what kind of drilling parameters to implement. It also, if they're trying to do horizontal drilling when they want to stay in a particular formation, if you're familiar with that formation, you can tell them whether they're in it or not. That's what I do here in West Virginia. These are Marcellus shale wells, and if they don't drill them in the Marcellus shale, then they just spent millions of dollars on a very deep, worthless hole. So my job is to ensure that that is actually where they're drilling, and on top of that, they can also take the logs and use that information to help decide where to put future wells, what depths, what directions to put current wells. There are different. The fields that I've worked in, they've all had slightly different or even radically different ideas of what my job is supposed to do. But anyway, he said you probably like that job because it is essentially an office job. You do have to go out and collect samples, and there is sometimes decent amounts of physical labor involved, but it's not really it's mostly an office job, and you sit in a trailer, and you like to read, so you'd probably enjoy it. And this, of course, turns out to be, as I consider it, a great big perk. So we just drove around East Texas, and if you've never been to East Texas and much of that area, they're oil derricks, just everywhere. On any place you get a view, there's probably going to be one on the horizon someplace. And these weren't derricks that he was familiar with. He didn't know these people. He would see one. We would drive up to it. He would go and knock on the mudlogger's trailer if there was one, which there isn't always, and say, hey, are you hiring? It took one day. We got about 12 phone numbers. We called them all, and one of them said, hey, we're interested. We need workers. And we drove down to Houston the next morning, and I got hired. That's basically how I got in. Now, the company that hired me, I only ever worked for 1 week. They basically went out of business. Later that fall, I got hired just around probably in August, and about 3 weeks, they said, well, we've hired you, but we need you to be trained, and we don't have a trainer available right now. But as soon as he's available, he'll train you. And that could be tomorrow, that could be in 3 weeks. Well, 3 weeks went by, and they still hadn't called. And then they did call, and they say, well, we don't have a trainer, but there is a third-party guy. He's not in our company. He's just somebody we know, and he needs a hand. He needs somebody to help him. Would you be willing to do it? I said, well, would I get paid for that? And they said, absolutely, you would. And so I worked with this guy who was basically independent. He was running his own little operation, and I worked with him for basically the fall of 2008, all the way up until just 2 or 3 days before Christmas. There was a brief period in that where we finished. There was a part in the well where they kind of stopped for a couple of days. I went home. The next morning, the company that hired me called me and said, oh, we do actually need you to go. And I had to drive all the way almost to Mexico. And I worked for about a week on a well there. And then when I was done with that, they didn't call me back, and I started working with the same guy again. And when we finished around December, just 2 or 3 days before Christmas, I said, hey, I'd like to go back home. I haven't been home in a couple months. And they said, that's fine, because actually there's no business at all. You were the only person we have who was still working, even though I wasn't working for them. So I left, and I never heard what happened to that company. Apparently I could have been collecting unemployment in the state of Texas for months and months, but I went home and they said, we'll call you, and then they never did. I found out later that they did other things, and so they didn't completely go out of business, but they stopped doing mud logging, at least in that period. For all I know, they're doing it again, but I've never really checked. In any event, the man that I worked for said, well, I really enjoyed working with you, and I had the potential to do more. I'm working with these other guys, and they have a lot of stuff coming up, and I'll definitely give you a shout. Now, I ended up taking quite some time. It wasn't until almost a year later that he did call me. And then I went and worked with him, and then he informed me that I wasn't actually working for him, that he had actually subcontracted with this other guy, and that I was actually working for them. And I was a little miffed, because I said, well, I never signed a contract with them. I never even met them. Are they going to pay me for the work that I've done for you? And he goes, yes, they are, and they did. And that's the company person that I work for now. It took a rocky start, but eventually I started working for them, and I acquired the skills in time that made me, rather than a potential hire or a new guy, somebody that they can rely on, that they do rely on, and it's been pretty good. Now, interestingly, the oil industry is very interesting in that uh, it is rich and powerful, and so it acts, and in a way it's sort of like a protective umbrella from the government. They have some kind of understanding or deal with the government. It might be an explicit one. There's actually a lot of conspiracy theories about this. Back in 1913, um, there was an agreement reached. Apparently, the argument was made that the amount of oil was about to run out, and so the federal government granted what was called the oil depletion allowance. This was basically to say that a certain percentage of the net gross of oil companies did not count as taxable income. So rather than tax every dollar, they would only tax 80 cents on the dollar. The actual amount has changed over the years, and that this was some kind of people tend to look down on this as like, oh, they're getting a failed deal. That's something everybody should get. Everyone should not. I mean, there should be no taxes, but yeah, that is an indirect subsidy, I suppose. But there's a lot of conspiracy theories around that. As far as I know, actually, that was abolished in the Carter administration, maybe the Nixon administration. But there's a lot of theories that the government and the oil industry have a chummy relationship, and I think that's true. The oil industry is helped by the government in the sense that they do regulate it at some level. There are certain levels of the oil industry that are hyper cartelized. Um, the most obvious and the biggest one is in the area of oil refining. Not only are the number of companies that are allowed to oil refine set in stone, but the number of refineries is set in stone. In fact, they can't even build new ones. So even though probably half the graduate students in chemistry have the technical know-how to, at the very least, attempt to refine crude oil and crude gas and whatever into usable, marketable goods, not to say that they'd all succeed in attempting, only a few of the very big firms are actually allowed to do that. In other layers, there's less and less regulation, and when you get down to the area where I am, as far as I'm aware, there isn't any. Um, it falls under the umbrella, the protective umbrella, from my point of view, of the larger industry. I've never had to sign or do anything with the government. Actually, I don't do, there's no tax withholding. My boss simply wire transfers money to me. It's up to me to decide how I want to spend or not spend it. Um, like I said, I've never gotten a license. I've never even heard of someone needing a license. My boss, I highly, highly doubt has a license. My boss is a very silver-tongued, I would say a swindler. He's a liar, but he also can't screw people that he needs to work for him. If he tried to screw me, I would know that. If he tried to fuck with my money, I would know that, and then I'd be gone, and he'd be screwed. And so it is an interesting, and if he did screw me, there's nothing that the government could do because he's Canadian. He's not even in the country. In fact, he was running a business in the United States without even being in the United States for about 2.5 years. I've still never even met the guy. I've talked to him on the phone numerous times, but he was actually deported for violating his visa agreements in this country. He's from Canada. He worked in the United States. He had a worker's visa. It expired. He didn't leave. He left the country to go home. For some reason, when he tried to re-enter the country, they told him that his visa had been expired, and since he had violated, the terms of the visa, it had been revoked. He crossed the border anyway, worked here for a couple more years. Uh, he went back to Canada. When he tried to enter a third time, they knew he'd been here somehow, and he got in serious legal trouble vis-a-vis entering the country. That did not prevent him from running a business, though, that employed me, and that I mean, I'm actually technically a contractor, a subcontractor. I'm not actually an employee. And my contracts with him are all one-page, simple text. Whenever he's offered them to me, if there's anything I don't like, I will call him and say, no, we need to change this and this. And it's never unreasonable. I never say I get $1 million a day or I get to be the boss or anything like that. and he changes them, and uh, then I'll sign it and send it back to him. There's no, and the reason I'm pointing all this out is there's very little regulation, which the at my level, if we go up to oil refining, different story. If we go back to oil drilling, to have the permits to have a derrick, an oil derrick, I'm sure, I don't know the details, but I'm sure they're very, very difficult to do. Um, but other than that, it's very interesting how deferential. Like I got in a fender bender on an oil rig, and the cops are basically like, we can't even come out there. We're not even going to try. The companies have enough money and enough political clout in most areas that they are able to basically bribe the government into not really getting in their way, and it shouldn't be necessary, but that's what happens. And I've been an indirect beneficiary of that, I suppose. Um, when OSHA's come out, basically we're protected from that. If we have, it's really amazing. Like my boss, um, the contracts that we have with the oil companies are literally based on him making phone calls and talking to people and them agreeing to it. It's literally based on a handshake. Um, and the word spreading to, hey, these are the people who are going to like admit these people onto the rig, that they have a job, let them be on the rig. And it's amazing because the amounts of money that we're talking about are not inconsiderable. And the fact that there's no regulation, I think, is significant. So in mud logging, there are a huge plethora of firms. There are lots of single unit mud logging units where it's literally one guy or his brother or his friend operating their own business. That's the first one that I worked on, was such a place. Was an independent guy on his own. The capital necessary to start this job is probably in the area of about $10,000. Which is not beyond the range of most people. It's probably less than that. I'm overestimating just to say it's it's about that much for one unit. If you wanted to start with 100 units, it'd be more than that, obviously. Um, and so they're him. Now the company that first hired me, they probably had, I think, 30 or 40 units. The company I'm with now, when I started with them, he had, I think, one or two, and now he's up to close to 10, which isn't big. That's still pretty small, but I really don't care because as long as he has one and I'm on it, I get paid. And if it grows, then there's the potential to have more remuneration, and that's actually what's been happening. For the longest time, for about half the time I worked for him, my pay kind of stayed at the entry level. And then after he started to expand, I mean, my pay started to go up very quickly, and the pay scale started increasing much more rapidly than I was even thinking would be the case. Um, but there's mid-sized firms, and then of course Halliburton does what I do. A huge firm, and that's not the only one, but there are huge firms that do this also. And so the fact that there's no regulation doesn't mean that it all becomes concentrated to one firm, which is kind of what we're always told. Like, oh, if we don't regulate it, the big fish will eat all the little fish, and you'll end up with one big giant whale. When actually that's not the case. The fact that it's not regulated, that there's no licensing, that there's no effective government bureaucrats standing in the way, means that anybody who gets it in their head that they want to try can, and many of those people succeed. In fact, it's not uncommon for people who do what I do to directly compete with their former employers. So when I was working in Utah, for instance, and I think I've talked about this before, uh, the company I was working with split. My boss had a partner, and they were friends, and it was their business, and they had a dispute. They got in a fight, and they both wanted to form their own companies, but the only revenue they would have, the only assets they would have, were basically their employees, because their employees had been working on oil wells, and like I was working in Utah with another guy. There were just two of us there, and the oil company in Utah wanted the two of us to be there. We knew what they wanted. We knew exactly what their proclivities were. We understood the formations. We understood what was expected of us. We knew how. I mean, they were very quirky about what they liked, and we figured out what they liked, and they wanted to work with me and the other guy who I was working with. So whoever we decided to be employees with would get the revenue from that business, from that oil company, and that was it. And that's what the oil company, because the two bosses were calling the oil company and saying, I'm the real person who owns that unit. And so the geologist from the oil company called us and said, who do you guys work for? Because whoever you work for is who we are going to give a contract to. And that gave us a wonderful opportunity, literally, to be bid over. I'll give you this, I'll give you that. And we got together and we said, okay, what do we want? What do we want him to pay us? What do we want as perks? What do we want changed? What do we want for bonuses? The guy who gave us the best offer is the guy who got it. And that was very informative to me. This is essentially a job. It's an entry level job. You enter with no skills. I had been doing it for about 8 months at that point, and yeah, I'm getting fought over. And it's not me. Like, anybody who applies is going to be in this position potentially. They're fighting over me and offering. And the only way they can get me to go along is to induce me by offering me some combination of higher pay or better benefits. That's the only way. And so that's what I ended up getting out of the deal. Uh, but a lot of times people would just call their boss and be like, "Fuck you, I'm done with you," and they will just call the oil company and be like, "I'll keep working for you. I'll charge you, 85% as much as my bosses," and then they'll keep all of it instead of having the overhead go to him. That's actually relatively common. It doesn't always work out. It's not always successful. Most drilling programs that oil companies run are not permanent. They're only going to drill wells in a certain area for so long, and once they're complete, they may not bring you along to their next job, or they may. Um, that is one interesting thing about the oil field. It's not like a desk job where I'm just going to go to the office every year. You might be talking to them about an oil company that we're only going to drill wells for 2 years, and then we're going to go and drill them in a different state. And if your plan is to just work there, so you move around a lot, but the the lack of regulation makes it very easy to enter. It makes it cheaper and it makes it easier. And so lots of people do. And so there's a huge plethora. And like the way my boss gets work is by really underbidding. He charges very, very little. If he charged more, and that's the reason they pick us. We have a lot of, I don't want to say it, but like we're very, very underfunded in a lot of ways. We don't have the best equipment or the best this or the best that. But the trade-off is it's cheaper. It's a lot cheaper at the end of the day because you figure how much they charge per day. Um, and so, yeah, it's not the same as having Halliburton be out there. But if you can get a qualitatively just sufficient service at a lower price, then lots of people are willing to do that. It cuts down their bottom line. They're interested in profits just like everybody else. Why pay for something extra that's extraneous? Why not get the bare bones for slightly lower price? And that's where we make our living basically, and it's a good living. I can't complain. Like, and the idea that some regulatory agency would come and they would know best. All that would do would give the big players the ability to coerce all their competition out of existence, or at least set hurdles that would prevent 90% of the guys who do succeed at starting their own business from failing. And that's how, like, the company that I work for that got hired, I met the owner. He's the one who hired me. Again, he was a bigger firm. He probably had 30, 40 units is what we call them. He started because he had a job as a laborer. After a couple of years, he thought, I'm going to try this myself. He did, and it was successful for a long time. I don't know, like, how rich this guy was, but he had money because he would fly around in his plane. Like, if there were problems on rigs, he would jump in his plane and fly to the nearest airport and go and check. I mean, like, he couldn't have been just scratching by if that's how he took care of business. So that would not be possible, though, if there was some regulatory agency saying, well, you have to have the board of governors. I mean, the explicit well, not always the explicit, but the effect of these boards is to restrict free entry, to reduce the number of producers so that there can be a higher price charged by those who are already involved. And when I look at my industry, and there are other industries that are like this, is certainly not unique to mine. If they have less regulation, they are much more dynamic. There are many more firms involved of varying sizes. The more ossified, the more stratified an industry is, the fewer producers there are. That is, I think, probably the best, most correlative way to decide how much regulation there is. Um, so the big three, there is a god-awful huge amount of regulation about who can build a car and sell a car in the United States. Even though there are a huge number of people who have the technical know-how to throw together something that could drive, not necessarily something that would be great or amazing or the state of the art, but something that could be functionally useful. There's lots of people who could do that, and most of the people who could do that would be willing to do so if they were getting paid. Um, but that would not be legal. They would be prevented from doing so. They can't start the same way Henry Ford did in his garage, or GM did in their garage with $90,000 in capital, which was a lot more back then. But the point is, the fact that there are so few is really good evidence that it's highly regulated, and it is. And it's interesting, the proponents of government regulation are at the same time against, the conglomeration or the aggregation of industry into a few firms, but the programs that they advocate, they have that effect, and sometimes that's even the stated goal. They don't want there to be, people who are unlicensed. Well, if you take away the unlicensed people, there are fewer providers, and so then there's going to be fewer providers, and there's going to be more of a tendency towards monopoly or oligopoly. And the the big fear about this is, well, if the government's not vetting these people, then the consumers certainly can't. It's true that consumers have imperfect knowledge. I don't know how many times people have told me, yeah, capitalism sounds fine, but it assumes that there's perfect knowledge. No, I mean, there may be some Chicago school economists, maybe some neoclassical economists who, when they like to make models, like to make that assumption, but I don't think there are any who believe that's actually the case. I certainly don't. And even if, this is just a silly argument because it applies to government too. Who has perfect knowledge about who's going to be the best president? Nobody, and yet they should be able to vote on it. Or do government bureaucrats have perfect knowledge about what's the best way to regulate an industry? Absolutely they don't. Never mind the incentives to be corrupt and to use that influence to benefit either themselves or some favorite group. So yeah, I thought I'd just kind of put that out there. I really had never even it never even really even occurred to me until relatively recently. Like, oh my God, I never had to get certified. I never had to do anything. My boss works out a deal, and this is what my boss is good for. My boss can't actually do my job. He's very familiar with it because he's been running a business, but if he can't actually do it. But what he can do, what he has that I don't, is capital. He's taken a big risk. I said it takes $10,000 at least to start a unit. He does that. He takes the risk of funding all that money, and then I just come on and I get a wage. I didn't have to risk any of my savings to do so. And when I started this job, I didn't have any savings, so I couldn't have started it that way. Um, and what he brings to the table is he's able to find the fucking work. If you ask me to go and find an oil company and convince them to hire me, the only ones I would have a chance with would be the ones that I work with all the time. And even then, I don't know if I would be able to, have the tongue necessary to convince them to go with me. And I certainly wouldn't know, at least at this point. I'm not saying I could never learn this or that I'm against learning. I'm just saying that's a skill set I don't have. That's a skill he does have. And I can tell you right now that the wage I earn is more than the hypothetical best case scenario profit he makes on the wells that I work on. Because I know how much I cost. I know how much all the pieces that go into what I do cost. And my pay, my day rate, my day wage is probably 3 to 3.5 times more than his day profit, the margin in the black that he is, and that's not even counting the upfront costs, the cost of things breaking. He's always having to spend money because a piece of equipment breaks and he's got to fix that, and that takes out all the profit from the entire well half the time. So for me, it's been a really winning. It's a cooperative relationship. And it's not exploitative for either of us. I'm not exploiting him even though I'm getting more money than he is. He's risking all this cash, and uh, I get the profit. I'm profiting. I didn't risk anything other than the tank of gas it took me to drive to come do work for him. Uh, and I don't see how that's unfair. How and I see how the lack of government. Maybe there is technically some oversight. I've never encountered it, and like I'm pretty familiar with the entire company from top to bottom. I know the boss, and there's me. There's no middle management at all, and I've seen enough to know that he probably doesn't have any kind of official existence. It's just his name, his handshake, and the service he provides. The service he provides is real enough. Okay, the oil companies wouldn't pay if there was no service provided. He submits a bill and says, "Here, we did all this for you. Here's the log," and there's no log. They're going to be like, "Why are we paying for this?" Um, and the kind of the way the oil companies do it, you typically is they have somebody on site called the quote unquote company man, who is basically there to basically sign all the receipts. The company hires somebody who goes to the rig, and he's the one who says, "Okay, this is the service. Okay, good." At the end of every well, I have to take him a little ticket and say, "This is how many days we're here. This is their day rate. This is how much you guys owe us." He writes a check. These guys are writing checks for probably worth, I don't know, $150,000 a day on an average day. Uh, uh, that's kind of that's an interesting thing in and of itself. Uh, but yeah, I mean that's basically it. It would be nice if everybody was not regulated. Then there'd be more opportunity. It'd be easier for poor people to start jobs or to work with their buddies. Not everyone has to be an entrepreneur, but you have a friend who is. Boom, you work for them. But if you have to get a license, if you have to get training, if you have to pass some kind of government test, all of a sudden there's a hurdle that's going to prevent a certain number of people from even attempting it. And it doesn't really benefit anybody. If the vetting process doesn't really prevent people who are bad at it from doing it, there's still the potential for harm for goods to be provided even with a regulatory agency, and it doesn't. There's market mechanisms like losing business because you provided an inferior quality product. I mean, this idea that food companies would be poisoning all their customers. I mean, just hyperbolic in the extreme. Yet somehow this is considered a serious position that lots of people believe in. So, I think that's going to be it for now. I've been really busy with work, training a new guy, training another new guy, and like I said, I think I'll be leaving to go to other states very recent in the very near future. So I guess that's it for now.